Hello and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For the free wire tutorial today, we're going to be working on my beaded heart bangle design. Now I have a demonstration piece here utilising raw copper and teeny tiny seed beads. I am going to be demonstrating with some hot pink faceted agates. So you can make this with a variety of different bead sizes and even shapes. So these are slightly rondelle in their shape and I will be working with round beads in a little while. Now, in terms of wire, I much prefer to work with raw copper. I just really enjoy how it reacts. And it's also something that's quite lovely because it will change colour over time. So I'm going to be using some 1.25mm or 16 gauge wire. And I have around about a 22-inch length of wire to begin with. Now that's quite an unwieldy amount of wire to get on screen. So to begin with, we're just going to warm through that central part and hopefully I won't knock too much of the microphone with this. So again, 1.25mm or 16 gauge, and that's around about 22 to 24 inches, dependent on how big you'd like the finished piece to be. So I'm going to grab in now my bail making pliers to create a lovely loop dead centre in that length of wire, and it needs to be quite a large loop because we're going to utilise it to create a hinged closure, a little bit of a hook on one end and a nice loop on the other. So I think probably number 4 on my bail makers. So I'm just going to cross that all the way over. It will clack onto the lighting array, obviously, because that's going to get into the way. But this is what we're looking to achieve, just a loop dead centre in that long piece of wire. So before I go any further at all, what I'd like to do is to get some really good strength into this. So you can do this by hammering gently around the rounded section of that loop, or you can do that by pressing down with your pliers. The next thing we're going to do is to create that heart shape within the design. So you can use a pen or a chunky marker pen, something like that, to create the heart. You can use a mandrel, you can use a round form, anything that you have to hand, or you could just go freestyle and create that shape by hand. So I'm just going to cross over the two sides to create that heart shape. It looks a bit like a pretzel at the moment. And again, you could make that much more effectively by utilising some round forms just to get those two lobes of the heart to be equal and opposite. Now, the next thing we're going to do is to return these long wires from that crossover point back and away in the other direction. Now you can use round nose pliers for this, or you can use your bail making pliers or your memory wire finishing pliers. And the way I'm going to do this is to grip across the right handmost wire at the moment with the pin that I want to use, which is the smallest one, and I'm just gripping that at the crossover point, pulling the wire away. So that's one side. We're going to do exactly the same thing on the second side now. So you can grab that from, let me just flip that over. When you grab two pieces of wire with one pin, the one that's nearest to your box joint is nice and safe, but the one that's furthest away is likely to slip. So again, making sure that you're using the right sized pin, I'm going to grip hold of that piece of wire dead centre. And what we end up with, excuse the noise on the microphone, is the section at the centre of that heart crosses over and you've generated this little channel. So what we're going to do is a variation of channel setting utilising beads. Let me just smooth and warm that through to get it to sit side by side for a second. Pop that down on the board and just take stock for a second. Now you can need quite a lot of beads. I'm just going to show you what we're working towards. This is what we're working towards, which is a heart shape with that loop at one end and then a lovely long channel set utilising beads piece that will go around the entirety of the wrist. So I've already pre-threaded this, otherwise the video will last 76 years. And I've realised that I've now run out of these beautiful little pink agates. So what you would need to do is find yourself a reel with a lot of wire left on it. I'm utilising 0.4mm 26 gauge, and you'll need to thread a load of beads on. So you can measure your strand if that's the easiest way for you to do things, and then add a couple of extra beads just for contingency to make sure that you have enough to form the shape when you want to start measuring. So I'm going to pop this back out of the way for now. I do have left over some of the little teeny tiny seed beads that I used to make this demonstration piece, already threaded onto a piece of wire. So I'm just going to trim away at one end. And what you would need to do is work on the reel, pre-thread all of your beads. It can take a little while, but you can obviously leave them on the reel for later use. So I will find a use for some of these. I might make some earrings or something, just to make up for the fact that I spent several minutes of my life threading them onto that wire. So imagine, if you will, that this is the free end of that 0.4 or 26 gauge wire. I've pre-threaded more than the number of beads that I actually need. So like I say, you can measure the strand, add a few just for contingency. And then what we're going to do is to start filling in the channel. Now, one of the reasons that I have this crossing over rather than separate is to add strength. If you're utilising much larger beads, it can be a little bit uncomfortable on the wrist, but you can really use any beads that you fancy. Rounds work best, rondelles will also work beautifully. So what we're going to do is allow those two wires to cross over at the centre top of that heart, and we're going to start by wrapping 4 or 5 times around one end, or one side rather, of those channel wires. So it's a little bit difficult to show you the way I'm holding it, but because I am right dominant, this is the way that I would normally kind of wire on. So I'm just going to rotate that around a good couple of times. You can, if you want to, bead that heart first, but I actually find it a little bit easier to add those beads at the end of the project. But whichever way is easiest for you, I'm just going to leave it bare for now. You don't have to have beads in the heart shape if you don't want to. With the hot pink faceted agate, I don't have any more of those beads anyway, so I'll probably leave that one bare, and I'll put photographs up of them side by side when they're both finished, and you can decide which variation you prefer. So just make sure that you tuck that tail away neatly. And ideally you will want the cut end of that wire to be on the inside of the channel, so it can't get caught on clothes on the upper side and it doesn't scratch your skin on the lower side. So I've made quite a narrow channel here because I'm working with some of those little seed beads that I had on the demonstration piece, and you can see that I've created a channel here with just individual beads, single beads. So you could double them up if you wanted to make a slightly more striking piece if you're using smaller beads. So why don't we do that just for something different to look at? So try and keep those two little U-shaped sections in the middle of that heart stacking on top of one another. And our finer gauge wire is hooked onto the lower of those two channel wires. I'm just dropping in 2 beads, taking the finer gauge wire over the top of the second channel wire, and I'm going to wrap 4 times on the far side. So when you're working with this design, I've chosen to work with a heavier gauge of wire than I normally work with. I normally use 1mm or 18 gauge for almost everything. This is quite a structural design, so we're looking to utilise that structural wire. So what you can do when you're working with a 1.25 16 gauge, you can be a little bit more flexible in your weaving. When you're working with lighter wires, you're quite likely to bend those channel wires out of shape. So I've wrapped 4 times around the upper of my 2 channel wires. I'm going to draw the wire across the back of the design, no beads on the back, and then wrap 4 times around the lower of those 2 channel wires. Now it is possible at this stage to just get your wire a little bit kinked. Try not to stress, try not to go too quickly, and everything will come together. So we can now scooch down the next couple of beads. So you can really pack these as tight as you can physically get them, as I will do here. So I'm just going to take 2 beads, sit them in the channel, and then bring the wire across the top. We've come from the top of the lower channel wire to the top of the upper channel wire, and we're going to again wrap 4 times. So it is very repetitious. 2, and catch everything on your desk, and 3, rotate all the way around, avoid getting snaggled on everything if you can possibly help it, 4 wraps, and then draw the wire across the back naked, no beads. So you'll continue with that weaving until you have filled up as much as you think you might need. So I'll demonstrate now with the piece that has already got beads pre-threaded, and as I say, you can really use whichever beads you fancy. Try to keep your channels nice and straight, and make sure that you have added a few more beads than you actually need. I have a piece here that I prepared earlier, and that is using some 3.5 to 4mm hot pink faceted agates, and I've continued to bead with as many beads as I had available. Let's just give that a quick measure. So the beaded section is around about 5.5 inches. When you add into position the size of the heart and the closure, that's going to fit many wrists. But however, you will need to kind of take note of whether or not that's going to be large enough for your requirements. If, like me, you actually run out of beads, what you can do is start to bring these two wires at the end together. Now this was done a couple of days ago, so it has gone very, very firm. It's a little bit chilly today, so I'm just going to put some warmth into these wires at the end, and I'm just going to cross them over ever so slightly before bringing them back to straight. So it's just going to taper, and what I'm going to do is fill in that end little section that I need, because I need just about 1/2 inch more on this design. So this is a contingency plan for you. What we're going to do is just a naked weave, tapering those two wires closer together. Now you will need to taper the wires closer together to make the hook clasp work anyway, but you can do that very, very quickly. Allow me to demonstrate by crossing them over and then using your pliers to straighten them up. Let's just lift that one so I can get underneath. So you can taper them very, very quickly, or you can make a slightly more gradual taper should you need a little bit of extra length in that design. So let's just straighten those wires out, and then I think I'm going to need it to come together around about here. So you can use string or tape or something to measure your wrist or the wrist of your intended recipient, just to make sure that you're allowing enough space. So the connection itself takes around about 1/2 inch extra on the end, just to get into that hook. So do bear that in mind when you're making your measurements. So let's just tighten that weave up. That last little one has come off ever so slightly. And what we're going to do is just a naked weave now. So my finer gauge wire is coming around from underneath the upper of those two channel wires. So I'm just going to bring that all the way across and weave with the same number as I have all the way around, which in this instance is 5. I'm then going to draw the wire across the top without that bead and fill with 5 wraps on the upper of those two channel wires, making sure that you keep nice tension, keeping that all neat and tidy. Draw the naked wire across the back and underneath, and then wrap 5 times on the lower. Now you can see that my non-dominant hand is helping me to keep tension on those wraps, pushing them up against the preceding wrap neatly so that we don't get any baggy wraps. There's no beads to fill in, so we do need to keep that nice and neat and tidy, and you'll get this kind of zigzaggy design with the plain wires. So going up to the upper of those two channel wires again, and I'm just going to hold that in position whilst I draw the wire around. And because this is a beautiful heavy wire, it's got that little bit of structural rigidity to help you achieve. So I'm just going to continue weaving in exactly the same way. Let's get some light on there to fill in that last little extra gap that I needed. Don't worry that this is out of shape slightly. We will get that all good and true before we move on to the next step. So I've just filled a little bit further along, bringing those two wires very, very close together so that there's a little bit of a gap, but not much more than you can fit your fingernail through. So I've just left that last little bit of wire sticking over the top. I finished with 5 wraps, and I'm going to trim just past the top of that wire into the scrap pot. And what we're looking to do is to tuck that sticky uppy bit down in the gap. Scooch those wires as tight up as you can possibly get them. Now if you struggle to get that little bit tucked away, just splay those wires gently and push your pliers down until that's super neat and tidy. So what we're going to do now is to start forming this round to fit the chosen wrist. Now I've got a couple of blocks here. You could go for a round form or an oval form. What I would say though is that I very much prefer to create these designs and shape them by hand. But if you need a little bit of help, you've got some blocks or any shape around your home available to do that with. So I like to have the heart kind of at the centre point on the back of the wrist, so that the clasp comes just about 2/3 of the way over. I like that as the centre point. Now, if you want that a little bit further and to have the clasp as the centre point, just bear that in mind when you're creating that shape. So what I'm going to do is to start very gently warming that wire through. Whether you're working with glass beads or gemstone beads, you do need to just be careful that you're being very, very soft when you make those movements. We don't want to shatter any beads, no matter what they're made of. So I'm just going to use the heat from my hands to start curving that around, bearing in mind the depth of your wrist as well. And just bring that around very, very softly, trying to keep in mind that we want this to sit straight. So we want the heart to remain central on the back of the wrist, or the front of the wrist, wherever you want to wear it. So I'm going to just bring that around. Now, because we're being kind to our wire, we have a little bit of flexibility. So what I've done here is I've made a classic mistake with this design, made it too thin across here. So it's very, very easy to do. Just to very softly and gently make all of those shape changes. So one of the reasons that I added that extra little bit of weaving on the end is to give me an extra bit of length, bearing in mind I ran out of beads, which is something that happens to the best of us. So continue to just form that around, keeping the beaded section as straight as possible until you get to the tail section, which we're just going to splay over to one side for now. The reason for that is we're just gauging size at this stage. So what we're looking to have is the end of your either beaded or woven section a tiny amount before you actually make the clasp. So why don't we just try this on for size? Pop that on the back of the wrist for a second, close that up softly, and I think that's going to be absolutely perfect. I don't want it to be completely tight against my hand, but again, I don't want it to be too loose so that it will catch on things. So just take your time, make sure that you're happy with the shape and size, and at the end of the day, if you've made a piece like this and it just doesn't fit you, it will probably fit somebody. So you can always offer it for sale or as a gift to somebody if that doesn't work out perfectly for you. So once you've refined your shape, you might like a slightly more rounded piece. You can even make them really quite angular and square if that is your desire. What we're going to do is ensure that this is the correct size. You've got your bangle set up. What we need to do now is grab some straight edged pliers, and we're going to create a bend towards the centre of the bangle at the point you'd like the hook to go into the loop at the base of the heart. So just ping that over ever so slightly and push those two strong wires down towards the middle of your design. Now they are very, very strong wires to work with, so do just take your time to make sure that you're happy. Again, you could just check that that's the right size and shape for you before grabbing in a round form. Now you can of course use your bail making pliers if you prefer. That's a little bit tricky to show you on screen, so I'm just going to grab a round wooden dowel. So if you're using your bail makers, you'll just need to gently prise the heart out of the way. The reason I'm not doing that is because there's so much wire on screen if I do that, that you won't then be able to see it properly. What we're going to do now is to create a loop that comes back outwards from the centre of the bangle. I'm going to do that by rotating the wires around, just like so. Now they are strong wires, so you might need to take a second just to refine that shape, like so. And ensure that that again fits in with your design. And we're looking to keep those two wires side by side, nearly through the dowel onto the floor then. So I think actually what I might do is use my bail makers and make a slightly smaller loop, because what we're going to do is to bring this back around. So you've got the idea of how you can create that form. Let's grab those bail makers. I think probably number 3 is going to be a good number. So I'm just going to grip hold of them. Again, I apologise, there's so much metal on the screen now, it's trickier to see. I'm just going to bring the tail back down over the top of my wiring and straighten that up so that the channel wires sit over the top of the channel wires. nice and neatly. If I remove the bail makers, you can see now that we've got that hook shape. So we now need the very last little section of the tails coming away to hook back up and round so that there's no jagged bits anywhere. The ideal at this stage would be to use the smallest number on your bail makers and just bring those over the top. Again, there's a lot of wire on screen, so I'll just pull the wire around, remove the bail makers, and you'll be able to see where that wire has gone. She says confidently remove the bail makers. What we're going to do now is to trim the ends away just here and then push the cut ends against the remainder of the loop. So let's grab those flush cutters in. You might like to do them one at a time so that you can completely control how tight that little snict is. Make sure that you're only cutting the correct wire. It's very sad if you have to rewire everything around again. So in a second we're going to straighten everything up, but for now what we need to do is to squish down those ends. We're looking to bring the cut end as close against the rounded outer section of the hook as possible. So you might need to do this from 2 angles. Just push that down until it sits neatly. So if I go from the upper one as well as the lower one, and then you'll just need to make sure that those 2 wires are indeed side by side. Now they're out to one side at the moment because we needed them to be whilst we were form fitting. Your other alternative is to lift the heart up out of the way and estimate where your hook will need to go. It's very useful to be able to do that anyway, just while we get these 2 bits straightened up. So just give everything a nice flatten down, a nice strengthen. When you're working with wire, pressing 2 strong wires together generally isn't a good idea, but today I'm just going to use my pliers to gather them, make sure that I'm happy with how they're sitting, and then give them just a little bit of a wiggle to make sure that they sit side by side and are indeed straight. I've got a little bit of deviation on that last little bit of the channel wires there. And then what we need to do is ensure that this loop we've created fits through the hook. Now, sometimes we cut this a little bit too long and it won't go through. And sometimes everything just works. So give that a push through. And there you have it. We have created our beaded heart bangle. Everything did work, which is a wonderful thing when that happens. If you find that this loop that you've created on the end here is too large, which sometimes it is depending on how big you make this first loop at the centre of the heart, you can just trim it away slightly. Sometimes you will also need to just slightly refine the angle of that hook. So this one moves ever so slightly down into the body at the centre of the bangle, as does this one, and that enables the hook to work properly. So at this stage you will then have your final moments of reforming the shape. And like I said before, you can go for a rounded one, an oval one. You can even go for modernistic, go for square. Just be careful if you're using pliers to form the wire shape here. You can very easily damage the finer gauge, the 0.4mm 26 gauge wire. So be very, very soft and gentle, or use nylon jaw pliers or tool dipped pliers if you prefer. So there are your options. All I did with the seed beaded version on the right here is just add some beads on the inside of the heart. So you have options there of how you can finish the design. I think I'll probably leave that one bare naked though. Not only because I've run out of the faceted pink agates, but because I quite like empty space sometimes in designs. I hope that you've enjoyed the beaded heart bangle with me today. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the content. Have yourself a beautiful day, and I'll see you back on the Gemhawks YouTube channel very soon. Bye for now.